Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. I'm Stephanie and I'm here today with my co-host Michelle. Hi Michelle.
Hi Stephanie.
And we've got a special guest today who's joining us in the studio whose name is also Michelle, but this is Michelle Cahill. Hi Michelle.
Hi Stephanie.
So Michelle Cahill writes poetry and fiction and is the editor of Mascara. Her short story collection Letters to Pessoa won the UTS Glenda Adams Award for New Writing in the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. She's received prizes and fellowships from the Australia Council, the Copyright Agency, and an Australian Government Research Scholarship. Her poetry collections are The Accidental Cage, Vishvarupa, and The Herring Lass. She co-edited Contemporary Asian Australian Poets and is series editor for the Vagabond Press. She's written essays on poetics, race, and cultural diversity. Welcome, Michelle. So, Michelle, as I understand it, you made the transition from medicine to writing. Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about that transition and how you ended up as the writer that you are today?
Hey, Steph. Yeah. Well, medicine was my first degree, and I studied for it was as you know, it's a fairly intensive kind of training, and so I did that, and that was in Australia, and in my fourth year, I came to the conclusion that I would not specialise because I could see that it wouldn't allow me time to be creative, and being creative was there the whole time, I guess. And after I graduated, it was another couple of years that I was still learning, as you do. It's quite a sort of a factually based discipline, and then I was working full time for about 7 years, and I really enjoyed it. It was wonderful. It's a very privileged profession, I think, it's wonderful to have that contact with people, and I'm interested in healing and health. And then I can remember sort of just thinking that, doing long hours and just thinking that there were other things in life that I really wanted to explore, and so I went to part-time. And then I can remember I was on holidays in Prague, and it was such a beautiful city, and I went for a walk. I came back to my hotel, and there was really nothing literary there around me, or no literary reason for being there or anything like that. I wasn't part of an established writing community, and a poem just came to me, and that's when I kind of, it was a little sort of moment of illumination. I wrote the poem, and I just had this illumination that I was really interested in taking in also using my mind in sort of creative ways rather than just with ideas. I think I wanted to explore ideas more. So I started from that point. That was really a turning point for me, and I started to write the poems and take it seriously, and so I moved into that. I was always writing fiction. Fiction's very hard to get published in, but it was always there. So I went into poetry because that was something that was open for me to go into, and I could get my poems published in magazines and then build up a collection, and I was doing that. But all the time I was writing fiction. And then in recent years, I was doing very little medical practice, and more recently I've stopped to finish my research, and I really miss it. I miss that discipline, and it's quite sad for me sometimes actually when a news story or something comes on television about medical things. I feel sad about that loss, but I think that that's also part of it's part of the sacrifices that you do have to wear as a writer. There are lots of sacrifices along the way, but I guess if you want to be good at anything, that's just the way. But I do really miss it. I really love medicine. It's great.
So how does I'm really interested in that. Like, how does that your medical pass, your pass as a doctor, kind of feed into your writing? Do you think it does? Is there a relationship there, do you think?
Yeah, I think in a way, in a sort of strange way, there is, like on one level, some of my work does have direct medical sorts of references, images sometimes. You know, obviously experience of death, of suffering, chronic illness, lots of like family disturbances and so forth is quite an insight into human life, and what living is about. And so I guess that there are some little resonances in my work. But I think on a deeper level, I'm interested in healing, and writing can be a form of healing as well, a form of connection and communicating. And that's, to me, why I enjoy general practice as well, because it is something that's about connecting with people, and unless people know that you actually care about them and care about their health, you know, when they know that, there's actually a big difference in how they respond. So there's a real art to actually being a good medical practitioner, and I think there's been books and work written about that. So I'm definitely, I think in some ways, writing as well, you know, there's that sort of, that tending to the work, and that attention that you give a work, and also that intimacy within the work, that I think there is, in some ways, there are kind of similarities between the processes, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I never thought of that way, but it makes sense.
Yeah, but also as well, I guess the other thing about it is that, you know, I have enjoyed being able to use writing as something that can address social illness as well. So, you know, the idea of dis-ease, you know, and like, you know, such as in my essays on race or mental illness. More recently, I've been writing about that. Yeah, so I think, and that appeals to me, that kind of, it's not an immediate kind of remedy, but it's not no less important, I think. Yeah. And I feel that I could have kept practicing medicine, but it's good for me to, it's right, it seems right for me to move into and explore what I can do with writing, because there are other people who can do what I was doing as a doctor. I'd like to see what I can do with literature and the skills that and the knowledges that I've kind of been, you know, gaining over the years.
You know, I just listening to you talk about, you know, sort of Copenhagen, but also the different parts of the world that you've lived in, visited, travelled to, and sometimes through, you know, sort of having that position as, you know, sort of medical practitioner. I think in Malaysia when you were there visiting, in your essay. That definitely sort of fed into
in Indonesia.
Yeah, in Indonesia, with the insight and the place that you could occupy because you wore the hat of medical practitioner, you know, sort of at that point, but also the way that I think your writing really sort of galvanizes that notion of you know, sort of a world in flux, you know, and the way that you know, the underpinning so much of the way that we think about the world is who can move, who can't move around it, and also sort of really the way that there's a real tendency to pin people to place and to particular identities that I think your writing in many respects completely and utterly dispels. What I mean, would you think that that's an element? I mean, particularly, say, Letter to Pessoa, your poetry, you know, that fabulous mixture that you have of places and people sort of jutting up against each other in ways that usually you say no to.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned Indonesia, because yes, I do think that, just to sort of briefly say something a little bit more about medicine as well, the other thing that it taught me is a way of thinking. It's very logical, And so I was able to use that in my activism, in my literary activism, not so much the writing as such, but in terms of, say, with how we can address social dysfunctions and problems, and, you know, the inequalities and injustice, and some of the things that you're touching on with migration and refugees and so forth. How do we address these subjects in literature? I think I do sort of take that kind of approach, which is quite logical, about, okay, well, you know, it's pragmatic. So, for example, when I did go to Indonesia, I didn't have particular knowledge of that field as such, and I didn't of refugees, and I hadn't been working in that field for a long time, and I didn't have contacts really. I just thought it was just more that way of thinking, that I take myself to a place and I'll go there and I'll see for myself, because I was sick of the media representations of asylum seekers and what was happening. I wanted to see I had to just go and see for myself, and that's what I did. And I basically waited till I got into a detention centre in Indonesia, and it was really helpful. I didn't write about that experience as such, that particular part, actually going into the detention centre. It was a strange thing. It was traumatic on one level, but it was also a sense of relief, because I was able to go to that truth, and I was able to experience it. And I think as a writer, that's what we seek. We seek those places of finding. We were talking before about spaces, creating an open space, and I think you're right. I think in my writing is often a process of becoming, rather than a structure of stable and cohesive formation of narratives. I used to think at one point that I couldn't write narrative because I was getting these sort of rejections. But there are stories in Letter to Pessoa that are conventionally structured. Quite a few stories are conventionally structured, such as Duende and the Sadhu and Finding the Buddha. But I think I was also interested in sort of what happens when you just have the language and you let yourself go with the language, and you're not bound or delimited by the kind of the horizontal linearity of plot and character and themes, which underpin a very sort of closed kind of narrative and a very stable narrative. Yeah, and I really wanted to challenge myself in my writing, and I think that's because I am an intersectional person. You know, I'm in between cultures. I'm in between races, and also I wanted to reach beyond the usual divisions of where writers belong. You know, there's quite I agree with what you're saying. There's quite a sort of a crude distribution or alignment of certain writers to certain topics and subjects,
which I think, you know, is really sort of evident in Letter to Pessoa, which is, I think, you know, sort of it's adventurous. In the sense that the heteronym is everywhere throughout it, and there is a sense that I think that one of the things that tends to prevail is that idea that certain people should write about certain things, and when that is broken, and you certainly just write from this place of you know, sort of, I guess, boundless possibility. And I think when I look at the things that you've done with Borges or Pessoa, you know, the Book of Disquiet, which is just a magnificent book, what you see is just is a writer doing what a writer needs to do, which is write what they want to write, not what they should write. And yet I think that one of the critical problems that you've encountered is critics who are actually sort of pigeonholing you in sort of a way that either you can or you can't write what you're writing. Would you like to talk a little bit about some of the receptions that you've had in sort of in reviews, etc., where on one hand there is no doubt that you are a gifted writer with sort of the sort of critical acclaim that should in some sense really sort of in some sense prevent the sort of criticisms that you've encountered and yet haven't, which seems almost impossible to comprehend.
Yeah, I think a lot of the critics that have criticised me heavily are white male critics, and to say something about that, I think the reason that they're doing it is mainly that they feel that what I have attempted is ambitious. And I would say that the reason for that is that I am going into a territory that is not expected of me, which is the aesthetic territory. That is claimed by European colonisation, that aesthetic territory. It wants to have this narrative over all the countries that it's colonised and all the people and all the people that it's colonised, all the stories that it's colonised. It's not just countries. These are texts and stories that are being taken up and have been taken up historically. And yeah, I think I just think that is why I've been criticised, that as a migrant, you are actually, the very act of migration is by its own nature ambitious. To actually go into another country and to forget your past and to start a new life, that is so ambitious for anyone to do. And so I don't think they should be so challenged by the ambition of the imagination.
I think that's a lot to do with you being a woman as well. Ambition is coded as for a woman as bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I definitely, it is also very embedded in historical archives around people of mixed race, particularly Anglo-Indians, and that's where my research is. Well, not just particularly, I'm sure it's with all sorts of mixed race people, but my research is focused on Anglo-Indians. But that research has actually enabled me to see that what is manifest is not necessarily something of the current phenomenon of, the critical response to my work at the moment. It's actually something that's very historically embedded. And I think for that reason is because it's historically embedded, that is the exact reason why I have spoken about it. It's not in my nature to be someone so argumentative necessarily, it's not, we don't want this kind of conflict. But I think that, that we can't help it. It's unavoidable. It's inevitable that we are in a politics of becoming, and that's what my writing does, and also my critical work. It can't avoid being engaged with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when looking at your critical work, which has appeared in Southerly, the Sydney Review of Books, Mascara, of course, and numerous other places, what you're definitely calling out is those sorts of invisible sort of those invisible gates that are preventing in very tangible ways, sort of that literary landscape of Australia from changing and moving out of, as you put it, a white with a capital W sort of terrain and into a sort of that that open place where anyone can write anything. What sort of factors do you see affecting the type of writing that we're seeing in the mainstream?
Yeah, so as you know, my novel that I wrote was not accepted some years ago, and so it was an experience for me, because initially I thought I thought it was about my writing. No, it's not about my writing. It's got nothing to do with the quality of your writing. If you get rejected, all you writers who are listening out there, take note. It's not your writing. It's really about who's allowed to tell what story. And as I say, I find it quite crude. It's so transparent. This allocation, this alignment of what writers, based on a range of factors. Their race, their class, their education, their background, what stories they're allowed to tell. Ultimately, though, there is a master narrative underpinning all of that. It's about authorship. It's about who is authoring, what is authoring this master narrative. Because these other narratives, the political narrative that the migrants tell us from the western suburbs or something like that, or the very aesthetic narratives that we have from the white Australian elite, these, or the memoirs or what have you, from refugee memoirs and so forth. These stories, what do? They ultimately embellish and support a Western narrative of superiority, and that's what it all comes down to at the end. It's superiority and positioning. Most of what's happening in our literature is purely about that. It's purely about positioning. And I ask myself, why? Why is it that critics are so hesitant and they see good writing? And why is it that publishers and agents have this problem as well? And I think the reason comes down to very colonial sort of thinking. It's settler colonial thinking, repeating the narrative that if I don't reject this manuscript and accept that one, if I don't award this prize to this person and not to that one, I will be the subject of ridicule. I will be isolated. That's how colonialism works. It's basically based on superiority which is based on colour. And in fact, I've seen it all the time. There are even shades of this, there are shades and of this sort of colour dynamic happening, so that it's not just about whiteness. But I think that, whiteness is kind of problematic, as all descriptions of race are. But we also need to probably recognise that that's just how it's going to be, that it is difficult to talk about these things, because on the one hand they will prompt reactive responses in social media and antagonisms. But on the other hand, we do need to actually probe around this area and this field and talk about what's causing these distributions and these demarcations of groups of people.
Yeah, because it is very much that sort of sense that in moving into this sort of and I like the way that you put it, into this sort of aesthetic territory, and what I've sort of noted in for example your style is one of the things that you bring together in the space of a single paragraph. Multiple sort of multiple strands of subjects. I'm thinking about the opening paragraph, which I don't know if it's still the opening paragraph to your novel, where on one hand you've got the walk through Sydney, the jacaranda tree, the asylum seeker, and then the character that all of this is being focalised through, who is quite clearly not Anglo-Saxon. And so you get this wonderful boundedness of a character who is capable of carrying all of those things around with her, of filtering, sort of the jacaranda, the Sydney summer, the, sort of the knowledge of this. And in that expansiveness, you sort of see a hope, don't you? I mean, like, I see a hope, because what you see is things changing in ways that they don't if we continue to sort of presume that certain people can say, sort of talk about this kind of a story, and certain people, because the overarching idea is that there is this, and I think this is where that sort of colonial mythology comes in, is the beneficence of the whiteness, like the beneficence that, look, we can have refugee stories and we can have asylum seeker stories, but God forbid, we just have stories.
Yes.
Because we have not arrived at that place where you just pick up the pen and you write, and you don't have to be held accountable to that sort of, that racial history or that genealogy or that migrant history. We have not reached that point when you can pick up the pen and write. And that has to be, sort of that to come, and that the reader, that we have a readership, a we readership, that the first thing that happens is that you open a book and you read. And that's not happening, because particularly with women, it's this need to pin them to their biography in this way that diminishes them and that explains them. Oh, well, Michelle Cahill can write this because she's got this background, not because she's a fantastic writer and gifted and, sort of is a writer, but because she has this background.
And then the danger there is also that you read it purely in terms of, like, I'm going to figure out what your background is, and it's just tethered to the analysis or the critique of the work is just tethered to how much does this reflect so-called reality, rather than being kind of treated and received as an aesthetic object in and of itself.
Yeah, and it is that sort of old idea that, sort of colonies don't have confidence in themselves as well.
Cultural cringe. Yeah.
Well, they do not have the confidence to say, well, something new is happening here, and maybe it doesn't have a precedent. Maybe it doesn't have a literary precedent. Or maybe it's, sort of self-consciously, sort of taking, hell, you've got to take on Borges. You've got to take on Pessoa. You've got to take those names if the call is there. Like the very notion that you ought to sort of say, oh, not me, I can't, is wrong-headed, isn't it? And so to pick up a character or to write the letter, to play with the style of Borges, all of those things are about recognising that everything's up for grabs. It is up for grabs, and to sort of, I think, be to sort of be critiqued on sort of on the level of sort of technique or sort of the success of the enterprise is one thing, but to be sort of critiqued on a sort of an existential basis is a completely other thing, isn't it?
Yeah. No, there's so many things that you've said, like about the emphasis on who you are rather than the actual text. That's something I'd love to see change in Australian literature, like much more emphasis on the text, because I think we're losing sight of the text. Less people are reading. Even people in the literary realm, they're so busy with all the things, all the discourse, So discourse, creates also the master narrative, and discourse, enables certain people to tell certain stories, but it also takes our attention away from the text, and we can kind of be aware of that, I think, and come back to the text. And as for myself as a writer, if I was to choose, look, it would be writing that I would be doing. I wouldn't be doing criticism. When I did at one point do an arts degree, and I didn't even do honours because I was so keen to just go out and to write. And so that's my choice, But the way I see it is that The critical work is a separate enterprise. It's a separate thing, and it's necessary. I see it now as necessary. For a while there, I was resisting it because it wasn't what I wanted to do. But now that I see on a deep level that discourse and textuality are so closely connected, and that discourse is actually, not only is it the thing that delimits textuality, but it's also the thing that can liberate textuality. So that is what I'm looking at, discursive empowerment. I think a lot of emphasis is on being on the empowerment of migrant narratives, the empowerment of migrants. But I believe that that will truly come in a much more nuanced way when migrants and people of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, however you want to call them, people of colour, whatever, there's a whole range of categoristic, determinants you can use there. But however you want to call them, that we have discursive empowerment. And so that's kind of like, I do see that as separate to my actual creative work. But I have to say, I just love writing. And I love, when I'm writing, that's the best place for me. It's just, it's that's something that doesn't hurt. It doesn't get tiring. It doesn't, I can just, that's what I love to do. And but at the same time, some of these dynamics, it's really good that we have this chance to talk about it. And I'm so grateful because, to be quite honest, they're really tough. It's really tough to spend, a large part of your life to forego so much, and then to find that a critic, slams your work that and everybody else knows it doesn't deserve it. It's still tough, and it's tough in the sense of like what it actually does to your voice, and I just want to say something about the heteronym, that the thing about the heteronym is not just the multiple narrative. The thing about it is that it is connected to something outside of oneself. And that's the thing. I do think that some of these narratives, the narratives of more complex identities and more complex, which the more, I suppose, intersectional you are, the more you are, the story that you have to tell is going to be complex, and not able to be reduced to something simple. That kind of narrative, it needs to be connected to something that is readily identifiable and readily known within the canon. That's what I came to the conclusion in my attempts to get my story published. I just realised that, I could have written this story. For example, the Nabokov story. I could have just written it as a narrative, or the Virginia Woolf story. It makes it more interesting. I do disagree with critics who say that I just did it to be ambitious, or I'm just mentioning names to make my work, embellish my work. No, there's actually a rationale behind it. But what I'm actually doing is I'm breaking through the mask that covers me and silences me, the master narrative, and I'm making a claim and pushing through that which is grafted over my voice to actually break through and speak to the canon, and I think not necessarily speaking back, but participating. It's participatory.
Yeah.
Again, I just don't think that those kinds of critiques are lobbied at white men.
No, absolutely not.
And that's seen as like a marker of their ambition is a good thing, is a positive. It's
absolutely.
It's something that you're supposed to do as a writer. I just don't think the criticisms that you're talking about would ever be lobbied at a white man.
No, and there are two critiques of my one of my poetry book, The Herring Lass, and one of The Letter to Pessoa, which actually went so far as to, so both by different critics, actually went so far as to compare me to a canonical writer. So one was The Herring Lass I was critiqued and described as in comparison to Sylvia Plath. And with the Letter to Pessoa, I was critiqued and described in a different journal by a different critic and compared to Borges. In both cases, what they did is they established that that comparison, and then they just brought me down to say that, well, I'm not as good. So detached me from that association. I would like to say that would never happen if I was white, and I would challenge anyone who's listening to this podcast or any critic to show me a single Australian writer who's a white writer whose work has been compared to someone within the canon, established canon, and then brought down. That kind of, I'm not saying that to be angry or to be, I'm saying it because I'm a logical person. I'm saying it because I would like readers and listeners to consider what is actually happening to the power of discourse. This is what discourse can do, and I would like to, I think it's just interesting to consider.
Because those reviews are the frames, aren't they, through which so many people will either choose to read or not read your work. And we were talking about this before. It's a lazy form of reviewing because it's not starting out by what, the book or the poems or whatever it is does on its own terms. It's actually moving backwards and saying, well, it's like, but it's not. And to me, that's actually just a poorly structured review in many respects.
Well, it's starting from looking at what's not what is perceived to be not there or not right, rather than assessing the work actually for what it is.
Absolutely, and I mean, how do you feel that? Because obviously you've been sort of managing editor of Mascara now for must be almost a decade. Do you feel as though Mascara is making a mark? Can you feel that there is, do you feel as though inroads are being made?
Yes, I definitely think we have definitely broken some ground and contributed to some of the changes.
What are sort of because just for people who don't know, what is the ethos of Mascara?
Yeah. So we have published migrant writing, diverse writers, and we've also published translations, and we've particularly focused on the discursive element, so reviews and essays about books written by culturally and linguistically diverse people, also like Aboriginal writers as well. And we have also, I think, created a space that's outside of institutions, outside of academia, but also it's sort of between industry, the publishing industry, and academia, which is predominantly white. I mean, if we look at the structures, this is what structural racism is. The structures are white. The establishment is white. So we've been able to sort of have really good collaborations with early career researchers who are not white, and also white Australians as well, who have contributed in enriching the journal. And I think that's exciting, because I think sometimes it's great to do write monographs and research and everything, but it also can be extremely helpful to write critical essays and reviews and build that part of the journal up. Really what Mascara is doing and has done, I think it is one of the best journals in the literary landscape.
Yeah.
For an online journal, we publish fiction. We've got the Deborah Cass Prize running. We have quite an active social media presence as well. And I've been theorising intersectionality and narrative mediation, and we use that in social media. And using the hashtag, for example, is very empowering, because it means that, on the one hand we have the social media archives, which are digitally preserved, but we also have the fact that, if anyone's running a search, the hashtag will bring up all the sites where intersectionality is mentioned. So I think we're actually breaking down in a way, or we're sort of presenting what we can do with the resources available to us. We're actually presenting new research subjects, or new approaches to empowering ourselves discursively through intersectionality.
Because I mean, it's a tough thing to maintain, isn't it? I mean, and
definitely.
you've certainly, I know, sort of really had to struggle in order to keep Mascara going in many respects. What sort of things do you think have changed or sort of contributed to that? Because it seems like it's a fairly self-evident, sort of journal requiring support, and funding and all of those sorts of things. So what do you think's been happening in that space?
Yes, it's definitely been the journal has been in crisis in terms of resources for several years. It's really difficult. But on the other hand, I just want to mention that we have a lot of support. In the sense of, just the collaborative support from writers and thinkers in Australia and researchers, and also from other countries as well. And that's actually symbolically quite powerful. But no, look, there's no doubt it's difficult, and I really do hope that things will improve, because we could do so much more, of course, and I think there's a need, there's really a need. There are so many talented young researchers who could contribute, and if we were able to sort of assist in that, and I'm being approached quite a bit as well by other organisations who want to partner with Mascara. So I think that it's exciting, and I do think that our partnership with Sweatshop at the moment and Writers Victoria is also really exciting. And I'm also going to be speaking at this Gatekeeping in Australian Culture Symposium at the University of Adelaide, which I think that's also exciting to have that kind of
forum
and discussion that's
And it does feel like there's a sort of a real desire to, and just from the title, the provocations. I mean, the fact that this sort of series of
provocations.
I like it. You're going to go provoke people. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's one of the most hopeful things that I've come across is this idea that we're going to provoke the sleeping beast, and see what happens. So, I mean, can you tell us a little bit about this conference and its aims and what you might be wanting to say there?
Oh yeah, so it's going to be in April. It's at the University of Adelaide, and it's going to be like I think a day of a symposium with papers on gatekeeping and whiteness and censorship and self-censorship and new pluralisms and things like that. And there will be Professor Snežana Gagne, who has been one of Australia's leading multicultural theorists. I'm very excited that she's going to be there because she was really instrumental in my thinking, actually, at a very early stage of Mascara. I think she's a brilliant thinker, and she's also very empowering. She shows a way through. Discourse is not something to the side. It's really, I think it helps us see through a way through these problematic areas. And there's also going to be Professor Mark Davis, who's written a book on gatekeeping, and Brian Castro, the author, and I'll be speaking. We're going to talk about, hopefully, be talking about intersectionality and narrative mediation, to theorise these and they write an essay or something like that. So I think it'll be really exciting just to I think just it's important that we aren't silenced at the end of the day. Like it's important that we keep pushing through the mask and the way that it really becomes somatic, it becomes visceral, what it does to you. It can feel like you're choking. It can feel like you can feel palpitations. When we found out that we weren't funded in December, I had a terrible month. It was really a physical thing, It was like we cannot separate aesthetic merit from cultural capital all the time. At some point in time, we actually have to look at race and the fact that structural racism is shaping this country's literary culture and its literary resources, and we have to consider that. We have to take that seriously, and we have to challenge that as a community. So I'm really thrilled that the people in Adelaide at the Kitsy Centre, I think Kitsy Centre for Creative Practice, I'm really thrilled that they want to take up this challenge, and that there are so many other, wonderful colleagues from the University of Sydney, like yourself, and so many young researchers who are just really helpful. So they're the positive things. So I'm hoping that there's going to be ways forward. I'm sure there are,
Well, it's only going to enrich Australian literary culture, isn't it?
Yeah. No, look, I think the essential thing is, we mustn't stop talking. We really mustn't, because that's how like basically these processes work. They work by profoundly silencing us.
I'm just listening and I'm just thinking, I'm hoping, Michelle, that when you come back, you'll come and do a podcast so that we can, I think in a loudspeaker, sort of reiterate and iterate and reiterate.
Provoke our listeners.
Yeah.
I like it. I love that idea of like not giving it as like almost a speech, but like giving a provocation. I think that's exactly what the Australian literary landscape kind of needs, and it is such a valuable kind of thing to put out there. So yeah, I agree. Come back, please.
Please. Yeah, come back and share.
Yeah.
I'd love to.
Talk about. We have completely run out of time, but I'm just entranced. I could listen to you talk for all day. So please come back. So thank you so much, Michelle, for coming in.
Thanks, Stephanie. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Michelle's. So this has been another episode of From the Lighthouse. If you could please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, that would be great. You can find Michelle at The Herring Lass at Twitter, or you can look her up. I think you've got a website, don't you?
Yeah, it's a gorgeous website.
MichelleCahill.com.
Yes, that's correct.
Or you can find Michelle through Mascara Literary Journal. So please go and look at all her writing and buy all her books. That would be amazing. And we will definitely have Michelle back. We'll see you again in a week, guys. Bye.